Masechet Nazir Daf Samech Dalid. The topic today is all about cases of safek, impurity. If you were next to or impurity flew over you in different situations, especially floating impurity has special laws, and one is nearby but is not sure if one came into contact with it or not. Do we assume that the person is tahor or tameh? It depends on many factors, as we'll see. Okay, so this all relates to the Mishnah. Mishnah said kesad yarad. Mishnah was giving an example of the difference between known impurity and tumat tehom, and it mentioned an example of someone going to bathe in a cave and there was a corpse floating on top of the water in the cave. That's known, you can see it. If it's down and buried under the ground, then it's not known. That was the example. Okay, since we talked about an example of something that's floating, now we're going to talk about other examples of items that are floating. The Mishnah was talking about tumat met, but the following discussion will be mostly about tumat sheretz, which is different. Okay, safa ena metame'a linyan sheretz. We just said, we ended the previous saying that this tumat tehom only applies to tumat met, not to sheretz. So this following discussion has nothing to do with unknown impurity. It's just a matter of, do we assume that something is more probable or less probable? Okay, so safa ena metame'a linyan sheretz. Tetanya safek tuma safa ben bekelim ben bekarka tehora. If a sheretz, right, a dead mouse or something like that, is floating on top of water and one was in close proximity to it and he's not sure, did he touch it or not? So we say if it's floating, the person is not tameh. Right? The idea is that if it's floating, it's kind of moving around, and so there's less chance that he touched it. Tetanya safek tuma safa ben bekelim ben bekarka tehora. Rabbi Shimon omer bekelim temea bekarka tehora. However, the exact cases are going to be subject to a machloket. Tanakh Kama says that if you have some doubt about a sheretz that's floating, unlike if it's in place. If it's actually in place and it's in private property and you said, I might have touched it or not, so we have to assume lechumra. But if it's floating, we assume it's moving around, and so you're okay. And that's true according to Tanakh Kama, whether it's floating in a vessel or in the ground. In other words, maybe you have a tub and there's some sheretz floating in the tub, and you were nearby, and then if it's floating in the tub, it's okay. Or if it's floating in groundwater, also okay. It doesn't matter where it's floating. Any sheretz floating in water, and you're not sure if you touched it or not, tahor according to Tanakh Kama. However, Rabbi Shimon says, no, it makes a difference. If it's inside a vessel, so then that's it's a small item. It's like it's on the ground, right? It's just in a man-made vessel. So then you have to assume teme'ah. Only if it's in natural water, that water that's in the ground, a lake, or something like that, then we assume that's tahor. But in the vessel is like being on the ground. That's what Rabbi Shimon says. Okay, what is the source of these of this machloket? My ta'ama de Tanakh Kama. What's their source in Pesukim? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avudimi ketib bechol hasheretz hashores kol makom shehu shores uchtiv al haaretz hakesad vaday magao tameh safek magao tahor. Let's see the Pesukim inside. From Vayikra Yud Aleph, the context is non-kosher animals that you're not allowed to eat. And it mentions, Al tishakeshu et nafshotechem bechol hasheres hashores v'lo titameu bahem v'nitbetem bam. Now the word litameh here actually is referring to the fact that's that's not kosher to eat. But it all happens to be the same word as ritual impurity. So we're reading it in the context of ritual impurity. And says, it sounds like no matter where it is, if it's a sheretz, one of those 8 creepy crawlies, then you're going to be tameh, even if you're not quite sure whether you touched it or not. From this pasuk, sounds like it's everywhere. But from the pasuk before, it says, L'chol hasheres hashores al haaretz. Where do these swarmy things swarm? On the land, on ground. How could we reconcile these two pasukim? This one sounds like it only makes you tameh if it's on the ground. But the second 43 says it sounds like it makes you tameh no matter where it is. So how are we going to reconcile these two? Hakesad, if you definitely touched it, you're tameh no matter where it is and where you are. Even if it's floating on the water anywhere, you know you touched it, it causes tum'ah. But if you're not sure, then if you're on land, you're going to be tameh, because it's more like you touched it, it's stationary, standing in one place is easier to touch, whereas if it's floating, then we can presume that you are tahor. So that's how Tanakama understands the Pesukim. Good. Rabbi Shimon, my ta'ama, what's Rabbi Shimon's source to make a distinction between something floating in groundwater, there we're lenient, versus something floating in water in a vessel, where he's stringent. Amar ula ketib ach ma'ayan uchtiv yitma ad ha'arev hakesad safa bekelim tameh bekarka tahor. Let's also look at the pasuk that he brings. These words ad ha'arev is actually from a different pasuk. It doesn't belong here, so that's why it's in parentheses. Maybe a copyist just was thinking by heart and added in the words. So anyway, this is from earlier in that perek, where it's talking about a dead body here that falls on something, and it falls on other things like an oven that has to be smashed. And then it says, however, ma'ayanu bor mikveh ma'im yeh tahor. A spring or cistern in which water is collected is always pure. That's a mikveh, right? Even if a dead body falls into a mikveh, the mikveh is still pure. There's no way to make a mikveh tameh. If it continues to have all the necessary amount of water in it, so that sounds like we're going to learn from there that if a floating corpse is that you're not sure you touched or not, is tahor. But then the rest says v'nogeh b'nivlatam yitma. If someone touches that body, then the person is tameh. So it sounds like it's talking about the same case of something floating, and it says if you touch it, tameh. Now, anytime you for sure touch it, you're going to be tameh. But we're asking about we're assuming, let's say it's the same case where you're not sure, and the first half says tahor, and the second half says tameh. What's the difference between the first half and the second half? So that's what he answers. So safa bekelim tameh, bekarka tahor. If it's floating in a vessel, that's what the second half is talking about. And you're not sure, maybe you touched it, tameh. Whereas the first half is talking about mikveh mayim, something that is in a cistern in the ground. And so that water that's collected there, if there is a body floating on it and one is not sure if he touched it, then we assume tahor. And that's the Rabbi Shimon's source. Okay, it also makes some logical sense that if everyone's agreeing with the basic distinction between floating, moving around, which is more likely that you didn't touch it, versus stationary, more likely that you touched it. So floating inside a vessel, is that like floating in a natural body of water? That's the Tanakama says, whereas Rabbi Shimon says, no, it's in a vessel, so okay, it's floating, but still it's in a vessel, it's on the ground, and that's considered more like ground. Okay, now, Tanu Rabbanan, Kol hanitalin v'hanigrarin sefekan tameh, mipnei shehen kemunachin, v'hanizrakin sefekan tahor. Now we're going to apply a similar law to things that are flying. Things that are flying are also floating, not floating in water, but floating in the air, or being thrown or flying in the air. So this Baraita teaches that any item that's carried or dragged, if there's a human being that's carrying it or dragging it on land, that's considered that if you're not sure if you touched it or not, tameh. Even though it's moving, but it's connected to a person who is moving it. And so therefore, that's the same as being stationary. The point is that it's on land, it's not floating. Right? Things kind of move in a predictable way. when they're on land, and so you're more likely to be able to tell, right? Oh, I just was there. I must have touched it, because you can see the trajectory. It's the same as if it's at rest. However, if something is thrown, then, and you're not sure, wait, it was thrown, did it touch me or not? Then the safek is, if there's safek, we say tahor. Okay, that's true in general, like for sheretz impurity. However, chutz mean kezayit tamet v'ma'ahil al penei tuma v'chol davar shemittameh milemala kilemata leituye zav v'zava. But this rule about something thrown has an exception, that where we are stringent, and that would be in the case of a kezait, an olive bulk from a corpse, that is mitameh be'ohel. And therefore, if it's some piece of a bone is thrown over a person, and it's possible that it went over their heads and created an ohel, or the other way around, if a kite or something flies over a person and a dead body that's nearby, and you're not sure, did the kite fly directly over them or not? Was it over this cemetery or not while you were under it, and did it cause tent impurity? So in those cases, kol davar shemitameh milamata, and also other things like a zav and zava. Zav and zava, they cause tumah not only by touching something, but also if they touch something, then that tumah goes to the item on top of it. Like if there's a bunch of mattresses and they touch the bottom one, it goes up. If they touch the top one, it goes down. And so too, if a zav, we're not sure, there's some item flying, and we're not sure if he touched the bottom one, but since this is a type of tumah that extends up and extends down, it's similar to tent impurity also, that has this vertical quality. And therefore, in those cases, even though it's flying, we are machmir. Whereas when you're talking about tumat sheretz, which is only about touching, then and it's flying, then we assume he didn't touch it, and the person remains tahor. Okay, that's a braita. All right. Now, based on these distinctions, we have a few questions. Ba'ed Rami Bar Chama, everybody's favorite questioner. He always asking these ultra technical questions that are really splitting hairs, but they're fun and they're interesting, and you can get at important principles through them. So Rami Bar Chama is going to ask a long series of questions to analyze this distinction between what does that mean? What do you consider something floating on natural body of water versus a vessel? So he asks, Met bekli ukli saf al penei hamayim mahu. What if there's a dead body in a vessel on a raft or something, and the vessel is floating on water in the middle of the ocean or something. So what do we say about that? Mahu batar kili azlinan or batar meta azlinan? Do we follow the vessel? In other words, we consider the corpse and the vessel all one unit, and this unit is floating on natural water, and so therefore we can be lenient and call it floating impurity. Or do we we look at the corpse itself, and what is the corpse resting on? The corpse is resting on a solid object. It's on a raft. I don't care where the raft is, right? I just don't want to know directly. I look at the corpse, it's on a solid thing, and therefore, in a case of safek, we're going to be stringent. Okay, good question. Now, before we answer it, we're not going to answer any of them, but let's make a further question. If you say that we're going to follow the whole unit, right? And the whole unit is floating. Met al gabe sheres mahu. What if the thing that the corpse is floating on is a dead, creepy, crawly animal? So kevan de tumat ayre v'hay tumat shib'a keman de machta tum'a bekli damya or dilma tum'a semichtahi. So this is different from a raft, because a raft is surely a solid object, but the creepy crawly thing is itself something impure. So do we consider it? It's easier to understand the second part. Do we say it's all tum'ah semichta, one solid thing of impurity, and even though it's two different items and two different types of impurity, we consider it all one solid thing, and that entire thing is floating on the water, and therefore we can be lenient? Or do we say, wait, the levels of impurity are different, because for if someone gets impure by a sheretz, he just has to go to the mikveh and he's good, he's pure that evening. Whereas for the dead body, he has to wait 7 days and do the purification of para aduma. And since they are different levels of tum'ah, it's as if the impurity of the corpse is on a vessel. Compared to the corpse, the dead animal is like a different object, like a solid object, and therefore we will consider it will be machmir. Okay, good question. And now, building on that, if you can consider the dead sheretz like a vessel compared to the different type of tum'ah of the dead body, and therefore we're going to be stringent and consider this person tameh, even though he's not sure if he touched it or not, but we're going to consider it like it's on land, and the person is therefore deemed tameh. What about the next case? Sheretz al gabe nevela, unevela safa ma'u. Okay, forget the dead body. Now we have a sheretz that's on top of non-kosher meat. Non-kosher meat also is a source of impurity, and so the sheretz is on top of the non-kosher meat. What do we say about that? They are the same type in that both of them, if anyone is touching or carrying them, touching them, they become tameh. Only for until that night. They go to mikveh and they're only good, and they're good till that night. So since it's the same type, same level of impurity, so we can consider them all one unit, and this entire unit is floating, and therefore we can be lenient because floating tum'ah, when you're not sure, is lenient. Or do we say, wait a second, their level of tum'ah is not exactly the same, because in order for a nevela to impart impurity, it has to be the size of a kezait. Whereas in order for a sheretz to impart impurity, it can even be the size of a lentil, which is smaller. So sheretz is more stringent, and therefore, since there are two levels of tum'ah, we're going to have to consider the bottom as a base, as land, compared to the top. And so the top one, the sheretz, will be like it's on land, and someone who might have touched it, we're going to be machmir. And based on that, sheretz al gabe sheretz mahu. Fine. What if you have one creepy crawly on top of another dead creepy crawly, and the two are floating on water? So these two are surely exactly the same. They're exactly the same item, same type of tum'ah, and so we'll consider it all one unit, and the entire unit is floating, and therefore we can be lenient. Or since there are two bodies that are physically separate from each other, they happen just to be touching, and so therefore we look at the top sheretz. The top sheretz is not floating on water; it's resting on a solid item, and therefore we're going to be stringent. And if you can answer that question, then we'll ask you another one. If you say that one sheretz on top of another, since they're two separate bodies, so it's like that the top one is on top of a solid piece, it's like being on land. What about sheretz al gabe nevela shenimocha mahu? Let's bring back the nevela, but the nevela this time is became liquid. It melted, so it's liquidy. So kevan denimocha havyala mashke or demahai uchlahu. Do we say that this, like a fat from a non-kosher animal that melted? So do we say that that's liquidy, and therefore the sheretz that's on top is floating, or do we say it's not it's not liquidy like water? It's thicker, right? Even melted fat is going to be somewhat thick, and so we consider that like a solid. And if you can somehow, if you decide that melted meat, melted fat is like food, it's too thick, what about if the sheretz is on top of shichbat zera, on top of semen, which is thinner than melted fat? Would that be considered like a liquid, or like a solid. And if you say, once the shichva zera it comes out of a person's body, it's somewhat thick, and so therefore it's more like food. What about sheres al gabe mehatat mehatat safin al gabe hamayim mahu? What if you have sheres that's resting on the water that's mixed with ashes from para aduma? When you mix it with ashes, it also makes it thicker, and that whole thing is resting on the water. So we're asking the exact amount of viscosity that makes something a liquid or a solid for the purposes of this halacha. Mahu layadrinan teko. We don't know. Good question, and we leave all these questions unresolved. Okay, typical questions for Rami Bar Chama, and I would guess that when he presented these in the Bet Midrash, this would be a subject of a lot of debate, and everybody would bring different reasons to say this way and that way and build one upon the other, and it would be a great teaching technique to think about all of these hair-splitting but theoretically very interesting cases. All right, good. And now that we finished those questions, we have another chidush that now we go back to the kevet of tehom. Amar Rav Hamnuna, Nazir ve'ose Pesach shalchu bekevet hatehom b'shivii shelahen tehorin. Mai ta'ama de la'alima tumat tehom lemistar. We have a case of either a Nazir or someone who did his Korban Pesach, and they walked over, they came into contact with an unknown kever on the 7th day of their purification. So the case would be like this. Let's say for Pesach, you have a guy, he purified himself. He was Tameh Lamet. He purified himself. He got sprinkled with paraduma water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. And he went to the mikveh. Now, on that 7th day, on the very same day, he had unknown on that day, he walked over a hidden grave. Okay. And then afterwards, he did Korban Pesach. After he did Korban Pesach, someone told him, oh, you went over a kevet of Tehom. Now, we learned in the Mishnah that person is totally fine. Only if there was a chazakah of tahara, but not if there was a chazakah when he went on that grave that he at that time was tameh. So here's the thing. If he went and he went over that grave on the 8th day, 9th day, anytime after he was totally tahor, then surely he would be good to go. If he had passed over that tumat tehom before the 7th day, then he's still tameh. Then he would presume of tameh. The question of Amnuna is asking, what about on the 7th day itself? Right? Because to be totally pure, he's going to have to wait till the end of the 7th day, till the sun sets. But now it is the 7th day itself. Rama Amnuna says we could be lenient and we can ignore that kever tehom. Same thing with a Nazir. A Nazir, may he declare himself to be a Nazir. He became Tameh Lamet in the middle of his counting, and he did the purification of Para Aduma on the 3rd and 7th day, and he became Tameh on that very day. Now really, this Nazir is also going to have to shave and bring Korbanot and restart counting, so that's why the Nazir, as we're going to see, is a little bit more difficult. But here's the point. If he went over kever tehom on that very day, and they told him about it afterwards. So again, do we consider this that he was a chazakah? He has to be a chazakah there when he was tahor. So Rav Hamnuna says on the 7th day, that's considered tahor enough that we follow the chazakah that he is tahor, and we can ignore it and keep going. It's not like if he was before the 7th day where he has a chazakah of tumah, then we're stringent regarding the tehom. So that's Rav Hamnuna's position, and the Gemara explains what's the reason. Because Tumat Tehom is not strong enough that it should negate the things that he did. The Nazir, he already became Tahor, he brought his offerings, or a Pesach, Korban Pesach, he brought the Korban Pesach. So these are positive things he did, and we're not going to undo now if we found out afterwards that while he had a presumption of purity, and this is enough of a presumption of purity, so we have all the criteria we need, and on the 7th day itself is good enough. Okay, good. That's Avhamna's chidush. We're going to challenge it. Mativ Rava yarad li taher mitumat tamet tameh shecheskat tameh tameh shecheskat tahor tahor. Rava quotes our Mishnah that says if a person went to the mikveh because he was tameh lamet and he encountered tumat tehom at that point, so he's tameh because he has a presumption of tum'ah. Whereas if he has shechbeh because chazakah of tameh, then we assume he's tameh. Only if he has a chazakah that he was tahor, he's tahor. So this is talking about here a person who's going down to go to the mikveh, and so that sounds like it's the seventh day. And the thing is, he's not totally pure on the seventh day because Korban Pesach guy, he has to wait till it gets night. And someone who was in Nazirut, he has to wait till night, and he has to shave and bring korbanot. So they're not done with their ceremony. So Rava says, why are you assuming that just because it's the seventh day, that's a chazakah of tahor? That should be called chazkat tameh. Okay, good question. Amar le. Rav says, you know what, you're right. I rethink my position, and I agree with you regarding Nazir. So even though he said here Nazir, okay, forget about Nazir. And Nazir, he has to wait till the next day, and he's going to have to shave. He's going to bring korban. He still has a while to go, so he's going to be considered chizkat tameh. But I stick to my position. Rav Hamnuna is saying regarding Pesach. The guy who did Korban Pesach, because he doesn't have to do anything, right? He just has to wait till it gets night, and so that's not a big deal. Okay, so he agrees with that. Amar le Rava, afana moden alach be'ose Pesach. Rava says, you know what? After thinking about what you said, and now that you agreed that Nazir would be chazakah of tameh, because he has to still do shaving, but what you said about Pesach, the guy who did Pesach, and on that seventh day, he encountered Tumat Tehom. I agree with you regarding Pesach. He's not missing anything. He did the mikveh the third day. He did sprinkling on the third day. On the seventh day, he went to the mikveh. So he did everything that he has to do. And so I agree with you. So great. Now they had this discussion, and now they're all in agreement until Abaye came. Amar le Abaye, shemesh. Hold on. Even the Korban Pesach guy, he has to wait till night. He's not totally pure on that day. He can't go and make korbanot on the seventh day. He has to wait till it's nighttime, and so he should be also considered a chazakah of tum'ah. So Abaye is saying, I disagree with you, Rav Hamnuna, in all your cases. Forget, now everyone, now he took back the Nazir case, but Abaye is saying, even the person who did Korban Pesach, but on the seventh day, he had encountered a Tumat Tehom, but it was before sunset, so he's not totally tahor. Amar le shimsha memela arva. But Rava said to Abaye, no, the sun sets by itself. There's nothing that the guy has to do. We only say he has a chazakah problem if he still has to shave, if he still has to bring a korban, he didn't go to the mikveh yet, he has to do something, then we say, sorry, you're right, you're a chazakah. But this guy, even though the sun didn't set, he's not 100% tahor, since it's going to happen automatically, even if he just takes a nap, and he wakes up after it gets dark, he's tahor. Therefore, that's good enough. So that's what Rava responds to Abaye. And even Abaye himself, after thinking about this, he agreed, which is really nice. We have three different Amoraim here who all disagree, but they discuss it, and by the end, they're all in total agreement. Okay, good. Now, where do we say that Abaye agreed that someone who is awaiting sunset, but did everything else, is a chazakah of tahara, and has a presumption that he's okay? From the following baraita, a little bit of a complicated case. Tanya, Yom melot tavi, toch melot lo tavi. We're talking about a yoledet, a woman who either gives birth or miscarries, has to observe a period of 80 days in which she cannot come to the Bet HaMikdash. That 80 days itself is split into 14 and 66. 14, she's actually Tameh, and 66, she sees Dam Tohar, so she's technically Tahor. but she still can't come to the Bet HaMikdash. Okay, that doesn't matter. The point is, when she gives birth, 80 days, and only 80 days later, then she can come to the Bet HaMikdash. She has to bring her sacrifices as a yoledet, but she can't bring them during the 80 days. She has to do it afterwards, on the 81st day. Okay, this is true also if she miscarries after 40 days of pregnancy. A fetus also makes her a yoledet. All right, so that's the simple law. Now, here's the question. What if she gave birth and now she became she has the status of this yoledet, while during the 80 days she got pregnant and miscarried? And so now it's all within the 80 days. The question is, does she have to bring 2 korbanot, or can she wait till the end? Waiting would mean she can't come to let's say she gave birth and then she had a miscarriage on day 50, right? Since the birth. Well, that day 50, she has to wait 50 days from 80 days from then, because the clock restarts. She can't come to the Bet HaMikdash, right? Until then. So you'd have to take those 50 days, add another 80, 130 days later, she'll have to bring her korban. The question is, does she have to bring 1 korban or 2? Since it was within the same 80-day period, can she do 2 for 1 special? And the answer is yes. Yom melot tavi, toch melot lo tavi. Toch melot means if she miscarried during the time period of the 80 days since the first birth, she doesn't have to bring another korban. But if it was on that day, meaning on the 81st day, she gave birth, and then she miscarried on the 81st day. The 81st day, is after the 80-day period. And so you can't, since it's outside the period, that counts as its own item, and she's going to have to bring yet another korban for that. Okay, now, Yachol lo tavi, this is the last complication. Yachol lo tavi al leda shilifne melot, aval tavi al leda sheleachar melot, vetipater mishetehen, tamodomar ubimlot yeme tahorah. Beyom melot tabi, toch melot lo tavi. The Braita asks, I understand that she would not have to bring a second korban if she had the miscarriage before the 80 days. But what if, now there's a more complicated case, where she had 2 miscarriages after her birth, right? She gave birth and then 50 days later, she has a miscarriage. And another 50 days after that, she has another miscarriage. So what about that? Would you think that she has to bring 2 korbanot, and one of them will count for 2 items? But why would she have to bring 2? Because she gave birth on day 1, and then she had a miscarriage on day 50. So day 80 from the original birth, that's all 1 unit, maybe you'll say, right? And so she'll have to bring 1 korban for those items, but then the second miscarriage happened after the 80 days. That's not within the window of time. And so therefore, since it's a separate 80 days, so she has to bring yet another korban for that miscarriage. You might think that Tamod Lamad ubimlot yemei tahora. That's why the pasuk says, when the days of her purity are fulfilled, totally fulfilled, only on that day she brings. Only if she miscarries on the day of her fulfillment, on day 81, when she's totally done with all countings, then she has to bring yet another. But as long as it's within the counting of any counting, she should not bring. See, here's the logic. She gave birth. Now she has an 80-day period. She can't come to the Bet HaMikdash. She can't possibly bring the korban. And so if she miscarried in the middle, so then 1 korban will count for both of them. That's clear. Everyone agrees to that. Now, if she has a first miscarriage, then the count starts again, because she can't come to the Bet HaMikdash for another 80 days after that. And therefore, any miscarriage that she has within that 80 days, starting from the 50 days, meaning within the 130 days, is also going to be within 1 period. And so, after the 80 days after the last miscarriage, right, whenever that is, then she'll bring 1 korban for all 3 events, right, for the birth and for both. Okay, so that's the Braita. Now explaining the Braita, actually challenging the Braita, Amar Rav Kahana, Shane hacha de mechasera korban, hatamna me mechasera herev shemesh. Rav Kahana says, I have a question. This right, to explain the Braita, we said that she's missing a korban. As long as she's lacking the possibility of bringing a korban, it's all considered within the time period, even though it's after 80 days. But she couldn't possibly bring a korban yet, right, when she gave birth, and then on the 50th day she had a miscarriage. On 30 days later, she can't yet come to the Bet HaMikdash, because now she's within a second 80 days that starts from the miscarriage. And so because she's continuing to count, so she didn't have a korban yet. And since she couldn't bring a korban yet, it's all within the same period. And that's why we continue, even if she has a second miscarriage, within 80 days of the first miscarriage, it's all one. Got it. But what about the simpler case where it was just one miscarriage, and she gave birth, 50 days later she had a miscarriage, and now you said on day 81 that, if she had the miscarriage on day 81 instead of on day 50, right, then she has to bring her own korban. Why? After all, on that day 81, she still is lacking sunset. We're assuming for some reason that she didn't go to the mikveh before, and she went to the mikveh for her regular plain tum'ah she waited till day 81. And if she did that, then she has to wait until sunset in order to be able to bring a korban. And so why don't you say the same thing, that she's not totally pure and able to come to the Bet HaMikdash even on day 81, and therefore this would go against the Braita, because the Braita said if she gave birth on day 1 and then on day 81 she had a miscarriage, she has to bring a second korban. Why has she have a second korban if she's lacking sunset? And to that, Amar Abaye, Shimsha Memela Arva. Abaye said, no, sunset doesn't count as something that's preventing a person from doing something, because sunset happens by itself. It happens automatically. Here, what we see here is, even though it's talking about a completely different case, Abaye said the same words, that the sun sets by itself, and therefore is not considered a deficiency in the status of a person. Since he said this regarding this Yoledet case, we assume he would also say it back with the Pesach case, that when the person, he purified himself in order to do Korban Pesach, and he sprinkled himself on the 3rd and 7th day. On the 7th day, he encountered a Tumat Tehom, and then he went and did Korban Pesach and found out, you walked over that Tumat Tehom. So we say, he has a chazakah of being tahor, because it was on the 7th day. He already got sprinkled. He already immersed. He did what he had to do. He did all the things he could do, even though it's not yet sunset, but sunset happens by itself. So we don't consider that he's lacking in his tum'ah, and therefore we give him a chazakah of being tahor. So in the end, even Abaye came around, agreed with Rava, agreed with Rav Hamnuna, and so everyone agrees that encounter with Tumat Tehom on the 7th day before of Tahara, for someone who does Korban Pesach, he's good to go. For a Nazir, however, since he still has more active steps that he has to do of shaving, so that Tumat Tehom will be during a period of Chizkat Tum'ah, and that person will have to nullify the days from before. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.